Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to episode 9 of NCERT International Relations. Today we are going to talk about the integration of Europe post Second World War and the rise of European Union. The topic is extremely important both for prelims and mains. So let's go beyond the NCERT books and cover this topic in complete detail. But before we begin, I would like to wish the aspirants who are appearing for the mains exam from today all the very best. I wish all of you ace the exam and give it your best attempt. So, starting from today, we will be conducting a detailed paper analysis of the mains question papers. Today would be the essay paper. So, Mukesh sir would be taking up the paper discussion today at 5 p.m. live on the YouTube channel. Then, tomorrow and day after, until 24th August, we will cover all the four GS papers one by one. The time slots are mentioned on the schedule over here, so please ensure you watch these sessions so that you get an idea as to how to approach answer writing and understand the pattern and the trend of the mains question paper. Now, those of you who are preparing for 2027 and beyond, many of you would struggle with answer writing and even covering these subjects from a mains perspective. So, to assist those students, Unacademy is presenting a dedicated mains advanced program. This program starts the 2nd of September and will continue till the 10th of January. This course will include 240 plus hours of classes where we will focus on covering mains oriented topics across subjects along with discussions of PYQs, helping you build your answer writing skills. Based on specific themes, we will take up different questions and look at probable questions and help you develop your answer writing skills. So, this course will also provide you with a full length GS test along with weekly questions with dedicated evaluation support where your answers will be checked along with a detailed feedback. And for every class, you will be provided with detailed handouts, ready notes through which you can revise the topics and inculcate them directly into your mains answers. So, this main specific program will be priced at 9,999. And as you can see, the entire schedule is being presented in front of you. We will be starting with Polity and Governance by Sarmat Sir and Jatin Sir, followed by Science and Tech, International Relations, Society, Social Justice, Internal Security, and so on and so forth. So from September to January, more than 240 hours of well designed content, curated content, which is specific to the requirements of the mains exam, will be delivered through the advanced mains program. So, those of you who are interested, please check out the details of the program provided in the link in the description box below. With this, let's get started and talk about Europe as a continent post Second World War. In previous sessions, we have spoken about the widespread destruction caused by the world wars, primarily how Europe took majority of the hit. Most of its infrastructure had been decimated by World War I and then by World War II. The economies had collapsed. The former European colonies, the colonial powers, they were clearly on the decline post the war period. Major cities had been decimated to the ground. Their industries, their supply chains had been broken. They were dealing with a massive refugee crisis and a humanitarian crisis. So this was probably the worst moment for Europe following the war period. And this is where European leaders faced a new kind of a challenge. The challenge was how exactly will they cope with this? How will they rebuild the infrastructure? How will they revive the economies of Europe, which had been destroyed? Because post World War, decolonization had taken momentum. Decolonization across the world had led to severe losses for these European colonial powers. As independence movements, national freedom struggles had gained momentum, from Britain to France to Germany, all the European colonial powers were focused on granting independence and exiting their colonies in Asia, Africa, and Europe. So, as a result, the European leadership at this point in late 1940s, they were faced with the question of the future of Europe. How would Europe be rebuilt? Can Europe ever be integrated again? Can the historical rivalries and hostilities, can it be erased? Because for decades, France and Germany, Britain and France, and other European states as well, they had intense rivalry between them with a history of war and conflict. So the enmity and the rivalries had destroyed the whole continent. And across Europe, the people had paid a heavy price. So their established notion that European states were the most progressive had been broken. This myth, this assumption had fallen apart. So they had to question themselves as to how to rebuild their societies, how to rebuild their institutional structures, how to work together to prevent future wars and conflicts. Because today, when you look at Europe, you don't get this picture. You think of Europe as a highly developed region, a region which has solved its basic socio-economic challenges, a region which has been a flourishing ground for progressive ideas, a region which has largely become united, and it is generally seen as one of the most peaceful and stable regions. But just a few decades ago, this was one of the most war ravaged continents in the world. So, as they say in international relations, there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. The best way to end hostility and enmity is to bring countries together by tying them economically. Economic ties can become a natural buffer against war and conflict. And that is what Europe tried to build post the Second World War period. So this is when United States had been playing a very important role in assisting the recovery of Europe. If you remember in the previous sessions, we had spoken about the American role in helping Europe to rebuild itself and revive itself. And it is this trajectory that we are going to trace in today's session. We will look at the different institutions that were created in Europe to provide for the rebuilding and reconstruction of the continent. And this will help us understand the eventual formation of European Union and talk about its contribution in stabilizing the European continent. We will also have a brief discussion on India's ties with Europe, especially the European Union. But before we get started, please note that as part of the NCERT course, along with these classes on YouTube, we are also conducting a free practice quiz every Thursday and Friday at 3 p.m. on the Unacademy app. These sessions are already scheduled under my profile. And if you can scan the QR code on your screen, you will be able to access all these sessions. So today at 3 p.m., I'll be taking up the next special class quiz on these NCERT topics. So do ensure that you join me live at 3 p.m., where we will revise these topics and practice a lot of MCQs. So at the end of the course, we'll conduct a mega quiz where you will get to attempt 50 questions, 50 UPSC standard MCQs. And those of you who perform well in the mega quiz will stand a chance to get a flat 20% additional discount on Unacademy Platinum subscription. So for the mega quiz, you just have to scan the QR code on the screen and enroll for the test now. And as we end the course on 31st August, we will conduct this quiz that will allow you to revise these topics, practice these questions, and also stand a chance to get up to 20% discount on Unacademy Platinum. Then if you want the PDF of today's session, please scan the QR code. I'll be sharing the PDF a little while later. Now, coming back to our topic, let's talk about Europe's integration. What happened in late 1940s and 1950s? See, the end of the World War initiated a new age rivalry between the two superpower blocs, one led by United States along with the Western capitalist democracies, and the other led by Soviet Union and the other Eastern communist powers. So as the world was getting divided during the Cold War period, Western Europe primarily benefited from the Cold War divisions because West Europe started receiving massive aid and assistance from the United States. If you remember, in the first two sessions, we had spoken about the Marshall Plan of the United States, under which the US Secretary of State, George Marshall, rolled out the European Economic Recovery Program to help rebuild and reconstruct Europe and assist in its infrastructure redevelopment and to revive the economies of Europe. So, with American aid and assistance, a number of institutions were set up that helped strengthen democracy in Europe. It helped Europe to get rid of the legacy of fascist dictatorial regimes that had ravaged Europe for decades. It strengthened principles of human rights, democratic rights, and especially Western Europe started advancing towards becoming a progressive and egalitarian society. So, the formation of the NATO military alliance also played a very important role in this regard. This transatlantic military alliance, where US guaranteed the defense of Europe and US started investing heavily in militarizing the region to essentially deter any Soviet incursions. And the American military presence that started increasing across the Atlantic, even towards the Arctic, essentially gave a security blanket for Western Europe. So, under American security blanket and American economic assistance, Europe started rebuilding itself one step at a time, brick by brick. So, an institution known as the OECC was established in 1948, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. This is the precursor to the OECD that was established much later in 1961, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation and Development. So, under the OECC, the Marshall Plan was basically channeled towards 18 specific European countries. The aid that United States was providing under the European Recovery Program or the Marshall Plan was channeled into this institution to promote political, trade, and economic cooperation between 18 Western European states. So, this American presence in aiding the reconstruction of the continent and America's military guarantees under NATO created the right stable framework that was required for Europe to finally focus on reindustrialization. Because all the advances of industrial revolution had almost been decimated because of the impact of the world wars. So these West European states started rebuilding their economies, focusing on basic industries like metallurgical industries, for example. They started re-establishing their transport networks. They started collaborating with each other to promote free trade and free movement of goods, vehicles, and people in order to integrate their economies, which would become the best natural buffer to prevent any future war or conflict. So the OECC eventually paved the way for the OECD. In 1961, the OECD officially superseded the previous organization and it gave birth to other institutions which even today play an important role, not just in European geopolitics, but in global geopolitics as well. For example, under the OECD, the Financial Action Task Force was set up by the G7 countries later in 1980s. And the FATF, as you know, is the global intergovernmental body fighting against money laundering and terror financing. It sets global standards for anti money laundering and counter terrorist financing. So, initially, when FATF was set up within the OECD Secretariat in Paris, its initial mandate was just to combat money laundering, to come out with global standards to combat money laundering and implement anti money laundering measures. But after the 9/11 attacks in 2001, and after the links between terror financing and money laundering were clearly established, FATF was given a second mandate, which was to implement counter terror financing measures. So today, FATF is the key global body fighting against money laundering and terror financing. And India is also a key partner with the FATF, a key member of the FATF, which is firmly committed to the standards and goals of the FATF. Then OECD also established the International Energy Agency, which today plays a leading role in pushing new renewable energy projects, in understanding energy trends across the world, focusing on issues like climate change, emissions, etc. So, OECD has played a pivotal role in the overall economic and trade cooperation that was achieved in the European continent. But parallelly, there were other institutions that were created during this period in the early 1950s. We had the Council of Europe, formed in 1949, which started functioning effectively from 1950-51. And this group acted as a political organization focused on protection of human rights, democratic rights, and rule of law. Since Europe had been ravaged by fascist rule, by the rule of Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and there were blatant violation of human rights, genocides that were committed, violation of democratic principles and rule of law. To restore basic order in Europe, the Council of Europe played a critical role from 1950s onwards. It was founded in 1949 with a dedicated European Court of Human Rights that till date handles cases of human right violations, not just in Europe, but even in other parts of the world. It has a dedicated commissioner for human rights, an independent office that promotes human rights across the European continent. In fact, these institutions are currently very active with regard to the Ukraine conflict. So, this institution is headquartered in Strasbourg, France, and its primary goal is to protect democratic principles, promote human rights, investigate into allegations of human right violations, and ensure that rule of law is upheld across the European continent. So 46 European countries are part of it today, and in fact it acts as a guiding light for the entire world with regard to protecting human rights and democratic rights. So under Council of Europe, today there is a very important convention that deals with cyber crimes known as the Budapest Convention. The Budapest Convention promotes international cooperation to fight against cyber crimes. And it's one of the key global level platforms to deal with cyber crimes. Until the recent UN Convention Against Cyber Crimes was adopted, this was the only convention that we had at the global level against cyber crimes. But please note that India is not part of it. India is not party to the Budapest Convention or the Cyber Crimes Convention of the Council of Europe. So these important institutions played a role over the decades to stabilize Europe and to ensure that Europe was integrated. But probably the biggest contribution with regard to integration of Europe was not from OECD or OECC. It was not from Council of Europe. It is from an organization that all of you are familiar with, that is the European Union. But the European Union took its current shape very recently. But it has a very interesting history behind it, a very interesting origin that you need to understand. The European Union, in its current form and shape, was established in 1993. It has been revised, restructured in 2007. But the very origin of European Union as a collective group of European nations goes all the way back to 1950. Over the last 7, 8 decades, it has gone through a lot of changes, structural changes, constitutional changes. And the current structure and the name was brought out in 1993 after the end of the Cold War. It is this evolution of European Union, its predecessor organizations, and the treaties which preceded the establishment of the EU. That is something you need to understand in order to realize how Europe has today been integrated under collective regional cooperation. Back in 1950-51, the Treaty of Paris was brought out by West European countries, primarily by France and West Germany. By then, Cold War divisions had emerged. Germany had been divided, Berlin had been divided between the Western and the Eastern Bloc. Right? We have covered this in our previous sessions as well. So, along with France and West Germany, a few other West European countries, Italy, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, they founded the European Coal and Steel Community, which started functioning from 1952. The idea of such a community was first proposed in 1950, which led to the signing of Treaty of Paris in 1951. And based on this, the first ever regional grouping of Europe was formed, the European Coal and Steel Community. If you have studied industrial revolution in Europe, you would know that Europe's industrial revolution was built on the coal and steel industry. These critical industries had taken a massive hit during the World War period. So now efforts were being made by major powers like France and Germany to rebuild their industrial base in critical sectors like coal, steel, etc. So for that, they had to work together, they had to coordinate, mainly for logistics, establishing the supply chains, or to promote joint cooperation with regard to mining, processing, metallurgical processing, and as well as even transportation over riverine networks, which called for integration of their inland navigation routes and focus on joint port development in order to step up their exports. And as a result, this community which was created provided for active economic cooperation between these Western European democracies in the sector of coal and steel. And this became the foundation, the block on which eventually EU was formed. So after the Treaty of Paris, which gave birth to the European coal and steel community, European countries had later come together to sign the Treaty of Rome in 1957. Under the Treaty of Rome, the European Economic Community was formed, which is considered as the predecessor of the European Union. The EEC, European Economic Community, established through Treaty of Rome in 1957. The Treaty of Rome also led to nuclear energy cooperation between these European countries as they established the Euratom, a scientific research institution in the field of nuclear physics and nuclear energy. So, three important institutions were formed. One is the European Coal and Steel Community that started functioning by 1952 under the Treaty of Paris. Then by 1957, the establishment of Euratom and European Economic Community through the Treaty of Rome. These were key milestones in the integration of Europe as a continent that provided for regional cooperation and integration, at least in Western Europe, because the Iron Curtain of the Cold War was still present. It would be present until 1991. Europe was still ideologically divided between Western democracies and the Eastern communist socialist blocs. So, at least in Western Europe, a degree of regional integration, trade and economic integration was being achieved through these institutions that were being set up through the collaboration of these nations. Then came the Merger Treaty of 1965, also known as the Treaty of Brussels. Under the Merger Treaty, the existing institutions, they were all fused into one executive body. The European Coal and Steel Community, European Economic Community, and Euratom. All their administrative executive councils, which were functioning separately, they were now unified into a single executive structure, leading to further integration of these institutions. Then came 1987 and the Single European Act. Through the Single European Act, there was further integration of their economic and trade policies that led to formation of a common customs union, elimination of certain tariffs, enabling the free movement of goods, vehicles, and even people. So finally, when the Cold War came to an end in 1991 and the Iron Curtain was lifted, as we have discussed in previous sessions, the former communist states started adopting democracy and capitalism. Even former Soviet republics started transitioning towards democracy and capitalism. By then, Germany had already reunified. In 1989, the Berlin Wall had been brought down, bringing about a transformative shift in the European landscape. So, with this, a new structure became necessary. As new democracies were being born, more and more countries were shifting towards capitalism, even in Central Eastern Europe, in Baltic and Balkan region as well. A new structure was required, and the European Economic Community was now restructured into the European Union, and that is how the EU was born by 1993. It was established through the Maastricht Treaty. So please make a note, all these facts can come as a prelims question. Through the Maastricht Treaty of 1993, the European Economic Community now became the European Union with the inclusion of all new members. The countries which were now transitioning to democracy and capitalism, all of them started seeking membership of this organization. So we saw a big structural reform taking place. European Economic Community, which until 1990 was restricted to Western Europe, it started significantly expanding eastwards by including more member countries from Central and Eastern parts of Europe. And in 2007-2009 period, Europe further underwent a few policy changes, a few constitutional changes through the Lisbon Treaty, which is the current constitutional framework of the European Union. So the key institutions of the EU, their roles and responsibilities and their functions, they're all defined under the Lisbon Treaty. And thus, the EU has become the leading pillar of growth and cooperation across the European continent. Now, it's very important for you to remember this timeline of how the organization has evolved, how countries have joined, leading to the expansion of this group. Because without regional cooperation, it is almost impossible to achieve collective growth. Remember when we spoke about South Asia, I told you one of the biggest drawback of South Asia region is that there is no effective regional cooperation and integration. That's the reason why hostilities continue to persist and sometimes it escalates into wars and conflicts. The reason why today Europe has moved away from war and conflict is because they achieved economic integration and regional integration through such organizations. So, what started in 1957 through the Treaty of Rome as a small collective group of West European democracies focused on economic ties, it slowly expanded decade after decade. More and more countries joined. For example, UK had joined the European Economic Community back in 1973. Greece joined in 1981. By then, NATO also had started expanding. And especially as we entered late 80s and early 90s, as communism was on the decline. Eventually, Germany reunified, Berlin Wall collapsed, and the Iron Curtain was lifted with the end of the Cold War. You see a large number of European countries joining both European Union and NATO, leading to a significant eastward expansion of both the organizations. So while the NATO military alliance spread eastwards, even European Union as a political and economic grouping started spreading eastwards with the addition of new members. So if you look at the countries that have joined in the last 30 years, you will notice that many countries that were previously neutral during Cold War, like Austria, Finland, for example, Sweden, they all had a policy of neutrality during the Cold War. So with the collapse of Soviet Union, they abandoned neutrality and they essentially joined the European Union. Then former communist states and even Soviet republics. Look at the Baltic countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or even Poland, right, which were aligned with Soviet Union or either they were part of the Soviet Union itself. Baltic states were part of the Soviet Republic, right? Poland was one of the key allies under the Warsaw Pact. So all these former Warsaw Pact countries, former Soviet Union republics, they all started joining the EU, leading to a significant expansion. Even recently, few countries have been joining the EU, and today it has become one of the most successful regional groupings in the world. Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, all of them have entered this organization, making it one of the most successful economic groupings in the world. Now, the EU honestly deserves all the credit. In fact, experts believe that the EU has been single handedly responsible for making the continent more peaceful and stable. The European Union, and of course its predecessor organization, the European Economic Community, they have played a stellar role by integrating the economies and by creating a natural deterrence against war and conflict. So, in recognition of these efforts, the EU was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012 as it has single handedly contributed to peace and stability across the European continent. Because trust me, a century ago, nobody would have believed that this was possible. Right? Even 70, 80 years ago, nobody would have envisioned that something like this could happen in Europe. Just a few decades ago, these very countries were at their throats fighting against each other. They had a history of war and conflict against each other. So from there, today they have become the best of allies, assisting each other, working together. They've eliminated border controls, right? Passport controls have been abolished. They've provided for soft borders to be implemented. They've adopted a common currency, right? They've created a common customs and trade union, abolishing tariffs. They even come out with common laws and policies. Essentially, individual countries have to give up their sovereignty. They have to compromise a bit on their sovereignty if they have to be part of such a regional collective group. Can you ever imagine this happening in, let's say, South Asia? Can you imagine India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh giving up a part of their sovereignty and erasing the border controls and integrating the region with common laws and policies? It's almost unthinkable today, unimaginable today. And this is how it was in Europe a century ago. But today, look at what has happened. In recognition of these tremendous efforts of the organization, the EU was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Today, the group has 27 member states. It used to be 28 when United Kingdom was still a part of it. But in 2016, the UK voted on the Brexit referendum, where the majority of the UK citizens voted in favor of Brexit. That is for Britain to exit the EU. And by 2020, Britain completed the exit process from the European Union. So now, Britain or UK is no longer a member of the EU. And currently, the EU has 27 member states. So let's dive a little deep into the European Union. Let's understand its structure, its functioning, and what kind of ties does India actually enjoy with this organization. That is something we'll take a look at. So, as I said, the EU today is a customs union, a common trade bloc, where free movement, absolute free movement, is provided for the member states with regard to movement of people, goods, services, investments, and even vehicles. So, this allows for easy flow of capital, be it foreign direct investment or institutional investment in capital markets. And given that the region is home to some important financial centers, the free movement of capital plays a critical role in establishing Europe as a key financial hub. It's also a region which has heavily focused on technology and innovation. It has been at the cutting edge of scientific advancement. So there is very close collaboration in the scientific domain, in research and development, from space technology to artificial intelligence to even regulation of big tech and social media platforms. These countries have a common vision with regard to data protection, data privacy. They have introduced some of the most progressive laws, which act as a model law for other regions and countries to follow. So the European Union has essentially provided for a set of common laws and policies. They even have a common defense and foreign policy as well, right? They have a common policy in the field of agriculture, fisheries, food processing, data regulation. So, in many critical sectors, they have come out with common legislations, policies, and regulations, which has today made the region one seamless economic entity. So, it's conducive for business, it's conducive for essentially setting up new industries or pioneering new technologies. And the region, as I said, has already resolved its basic socio-economic problems of poverty, education, healthcare. So as a result, the region has really thrived. If you look at its Human Development Index, almost all of the EU members, they fall in the very high Human Development Index category. 26 out of 27 EU members are in the very high HDI category. So it's essentially a grouping of the global north. It's a grouping of developed, industrialized nations with firm faith in democracy and constitutional principles and rule of law. In fact, this is a mandatory requirement. To be a member of the EU, the country should be firmly committed to protecting human rights, to protecting democratic rights, civil liberties, constitutional rights, and ensuring that rule of law is upheld all the time. So the European countries have today adopted a common monetary union as well by adopting euro as the common currency. In 1999, euro was introduced as a common currency, and a number of EU members have compromised on their monetary sovereignty, their fiscal and monetary sovereignty. And essentially, they have agreed to accept a common currency which brings its own advantages and benefits. It will basically provide for seamless cross border cash movement, right? It will make investments easier, it will promote cross border trade, and this brings enormous benefits. So there are 21 EU member countries that have today adopted euro as their common currency. Out of 27 nations, 21 countries have adopted euro as their common currency. They are part of the monetary union, and the European Central Bank, which is a part of the EU, regulates the currency, like how India's central bank, RBI, adopts and implements the monetary policy, manages the rupee and the liquidity in the market, and tackles inflation. A similar role is performed by a European level central bank, the ECB, which is one of the primary organs of the European Union. So please note down the countries that have recently joined the Eurozone. This can be asked in prelims. In 2023, Croatia had become the latest entrant, but more recently, Bulgaria has become the latest country to join the Eurozone. Earlier this year, in January 2026, Bulgaria has adopted Euro as its national currency, replacing its own currency and adopting a common monetary policy with the other Eurozone nations. So there are few members of EU who have retained their monetary sovereignty, they have retained their own national currencies, but 21 out of 27 EU member states today have accepted the euro. There are few non-EU member countries as well which have adopted the euro as their currency. So please remember these countries. This could be very relevant for factual prelims questions. Here you have the list of all the 20 nations, plus you should add Bulgaria to this, which is a recent entrant that has joined just few months ago. So 21 countries in total have now become part of Eurozone. There are few other non-Eurozone members of the EU, and that is something I want you to remember. Czech Republic, Denmark, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Sweden. They retain their national currencies. They have not accepted euro, though they are members of the EU. So this map again helps you understand and try and remember the countries that have adopted euro and the countries that haven't adopted the euro as their common currency. Now coming to their border controls and passport controls, there's something called the Schengen Agreement, which has established the Schengen zone that provides for abolition of passport controls and abolishes hard border controls. So when you look at countries with hard border controls, you have very strict immigration standards, right? Border crossing points are heavily securitized, be it a land border crossing point or an airport or a seaport, which are the ports of entry. There will be very strict security and border patrolling, which is present, manned by security forces, ensuring that no foreigner can set foot without the required visa requirements, right? Through visa process, a strict immigration control standard is implemented when hard border controls are present. And generally, these borders, especially land borders, it could be fenced. It could be completely, isolated and completely carved out separately through hard physical measures, where fencing can be taken up and physical barriers can be erected to clearly separate the two nations, where there is intense border patrolling and the border guarding forces, they essentially control the flow of the people, right? And immigration laws will be so strict that without a valid visa, you will not be allowed entry into such countries. So when this is the norm, the global norm is most countries have hard border controls, right? But in the European region, countries that have accepted the Schengen zone, right, they have abolished all passport controls and hard border controls. This is true regional integration at its best. Around 25 members of European Union out of the 27 states have become part of the Schengen area. There are 4 other countries which are non-EU countries. They're not members of EU, but they have become part of the Schengen zone. So in total, 29 European countries have become part of the Schengen zone, abolishing passport controls and hard border controls. So they have replaced hard border with soft border controls, providing for an open border system, something similar to what India and Nepal have, right? India has an open border system only with Nepal, which we have covered in our previous sessions. So a similar arrangement exists between the 29 European nations, and 25 of them are members of EU and 4 are non-EU members. So please remember the countries which are part of Schengen zone, which are not part of it, which are the non-EU countries that are part of Schengen zone. These basic facts is also very important for the exam. So if 25 EU members out of 27 are part of Schengen zone, it means there are 2 EU members which have not accepted the Schengen Agreement. So which are those 2 countries? It is Cyprus and Ireland. That is the Republic of Ireland. Cyprus and Republic of Ireland, though they are members of European Union, they have not joined the Schengen zone. They're not part of the Schengen Agreement, and they maintain hard border controls with rest of the EU members. Then there are 4 non-EU member countries that have joined Schengen zone. These are basically part of the EFTA, European Free Trade Association, the same group with which India has recently signed an FTA, right? In 2024, India announced an FTA which has now taken effect from last year. India now has a FTA with European Union as well, right? Which is being formalized and finalized, which is about to be implemented probably by next year. So EFTA countries include Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. These 4 European countries, they are not members of EU. They have stayed out of the European Union. So they're not part of the same political and economic union. However, they have chosen to take the advantage of border control abolishment by becoming part of the Schengen zone. So there are 4 non-EU member countries which have a separate group called EFTA. So they have a separate trading bloc, a separate free market mechanism they have created. And these 4 non-EU member nations have joined the Schengen zone, thus ensuring that there are 29 member countries in the Schengen Agreement. 27 essentially EU members are there, out of which 25 EU members have joined Schengen zone. And there are 4 non-EU members also who are part of Schengen zone, taking the total number of countries to 29. So Romania and Bulgaria are the latest entrants to join the Schengen Agreement in 2025. Prior to that, Croatia had joined in 2023. So please remember these last 2-3 countries that have joined the Schengen Agreement and those who have joined the Eurozone as well. Now, when you look at the map, just to visualize, this is where Cyprus is located. This is Republic of Ireland. So these two are EU members, but they have not accepted the Schengen Agreement. They're not part of the Schengen zone, meaning they retain their hard border controls. Then you have your EFTA countries, the ones which are shaded in yellow: Iceland, Norway, then Switzerland and Liechtenstein. These 4 countries are part of a separate group called European Free Trade Association. But though they are not members of EU, they have become part of the Schengen zone. So basically 25 EU members plus 4 EFTA countries. In total, 29 countries are part of the Schengen zone. So these are some essential facts for your prelims. Now coming to the structure of the European Union, which is provided under the Maastricht Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty. The Maastricht Treaty of 1993 established the European Union in its current form and provided for its eastward expansion. Then the 2009 Lisbon Treaty has provided for further refinement of its architecture. So you should know about the primary organs of EU and their roles and functions. So when you look at European Union, there are few primary organs. First, we have the European Council at the top. What is the European Council? European Council is the apex body, the highest decision-making body of the EU. It basically consists of the leaders of EU member states, the head of governments, the head of states are essentially part of it. So 27 leaders of the EU member states are part of the European Council. For example, the president of France, the chancellor of Germany, right? The prime minister of Italy. So head of states and head of governments are part of European Council. It's an apex body. It has its own president who heads the European Council, and it basically provides overall guidance and policy direction to the entire European Union. So European Council will not sit and make laws and policies. That's not their job. It's a council of the top leaders. So they come together to provide the overall direction, to lay the vision and identify the priority areas for the entire organization. Right? They will guide the entire organization in the right path, in the desired direction by setting few benchmarks by identifying the key priorities. So this is the apex level body. The highest decision making body of the European Union is the European Council, which comprises of the leaders of the member states, the head of states and head of governments. Then we have two legislative bodies of the European Union. There are two legislative bodies. One is the European Parliament, and the other is the Council of the European Union. Now, please don't confuse this with Council of Europe that we studied earlier. Council of Europe is a separate organization altogether. Council of Europe that was set up in 1949 after the World War period, which focuses on protecting democracy and human rights and rule of law. That's a completely separate European organization. It's distinct from European Union. Whereas Council of the EU is one of the legislative organs within the European Union. Now think of it like a bicameral legislature. For example, how Indian Parliament has a Lok Sabha and a Rajya Sabha. A very similar setup exists with European legislative bodies. The European Parliament has direct elections where the citizens elect their representatives. The members of parliament, the MPs, are directly elected by the citizens of Europe. And Council of EU, on the other hand, it consists of the nominated ministers and diplomats of the respective member countries. Just like how our Rajya Sabha has largely nominated seats or indirect election, right? In a similar way, sort of a similar way, Council of EU basically consists of respective ministers, diplomats who are acting as representatives of the member states. So they are essentially nominated. They are not elected here. They might have been elected by their respective electorate, but when it comes to working in the Council of the EU, they are essentially nominated by the member states. Whereas European Parliament has direct elections like our Lok Sabha, how people elect their MPs. Similarly, European citizens elect their respective representatives. These are the two legislative bodies of the European Union. So obviously, the powers of the legislative body includes making laws, controlling the budget. That is the primary role of any legislative organ, right? So the common laws that are passed, they are brought out by the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. Then overall control of the budget is under these two legislative bodies. So European Parliament directly elected, Council of EU largely consisting of ministers and diplomats who are essentially nominated. Then we have the European Commission. What is the European Commission? It is the executive branch of the European Union. This is the secretariat comprising of officials which executes, implements the directions of the Council and the laws made by the Parliament and the Council of the EU. Is that clear? This is the executive body comprising of officials who will basically aid in the functioning of the European Parliament. They'll assist and advise the Council of the EU. They'll also aid and advise and assist the European Council. And whatever guidance is provided, whatever laws are passed, decisions are taken, they are implemented, executed by the European Commission. So for example, when India was negotiating the FTA with EU, negotiations was between Indian government officials and officials of the European Commission, which is the executive branch of the EU. Once the FTA was finalized, once it has been signed, now it is being presented for signature before the Parliament and the Council of the EU. They have to sign and ratify it. So this is a long due process, right? The India-EU FTA will not go into immediate effect, though it has been signed between the two executives. It will have to be ratified by the European Parliament. It will have to be tabled and discussed in the Council of the EU, and a final approval will have to be given by the European Council. So a lot of steps are still pending with regard to the India-EU FTA. So European Commission, the fourth organ, functions as the executive organ implementing the decisions, aiding and advising the European Council, the European Parliament, and the Council of the EU. Then finally, European Union also has a dedicated central bank, a dedicated judiciary, and a court of auditors. Like how any state would have a judiciary, a Supreme Court, a central bank to control the monetary policy, auditor to audit the accounts. In a very similar fashion, the European Union has these institutions as well. The European Central Bank, ECB, regulates the euro. It implements the monetary policy for the Eurozone countries, managing liquidity levels, combating inflation. It is also known for assisting the countries which have faced an economic crisis. In fact, after the global recession of 2008, several European countries went through a massive economic crisis. The PIGS countries, Portugal, Ireland, Iceland, Greece, Spain, they all received liquidity support and financial backing from the European Central Bank. The Court of Justice of the EU settles any disputes between the member states. Any disputes arising that require adjudication is handled by the Court of Justice of the EU. Then even any disputes related to trade, investments, disputes involving corporate entities can also be handled by the European Court of Justice. And the European Court of Auditors audits the expenses of the European Union, and the overall accounts are audited by the Court of Auditors. So these are the primary organs of the EU that you need to remember. You should know the overall structure, their functions, what is their specific mandate. Now, coming to India EU focus areas. See, for India, Europe as a region is extremely critical. West Europe, Nordic Scandinavia region, Central Eastern Europe, even the Balkan and the Baltic region and the Mediterranean belt. All parts of Europe are equally important, be it for trade, for defense and security ties, for investments, for cultural and people to people ties. So, when you look at trade and investment, you should know that Europe is one of the biggest markets for India with regard to our exports. If you look at the overall bilateral trade, EU is one of our largest trading partners after China and US, which are India's two largest trading partners. EU comes at the third position generally, right? If I take a grouping into account as well, if I take only countries, it is UAE at the third position generally after China and US. But if we take EU as well, it often overtakes even UAE, becoming our third largest trading partner. It's also a critical export market, especially for Indian agriculture, Indian MSME industries. They depend heavily on the European market for exports. Many labor intensive sectors in India, like gems and jewelry, garments, textiles, food processing, they depend heavily on the European market. And Europe is also a big source of investments into India, from France and Germany to Belgium to Denmark, multiple nations in Europe, many of them who are members of EU, they are major investors in India, be it in infrastructure, be it in clean renewable energy projects, or be it in tech startups or critical emerging technology based startups in the country, even in Indian pharma companies. There's a lot of European capital, which is very crucial for India's economic growth and development. So now the two sides are taking this forward with a FTA that was announced during the Republic Day celebrations of this year. Both sides have called it the mother of all trade deals. The FTA has now been signed, and it will take some time for ratification to be completed. Hopefully, by next year, it might take effect and it might bring enormous benefits to both the sides. This FTA was much awaited. In fact, the negotiations for this FTA began in 2007 and it has been concluded in 2026. It's been almost 19 years. In between, there was a big gap where both sides had stopped the negotiations and they had backed off from the trade agreement. That's because the EU being a developed region and India being a developing nation, there will be fundamental differences in any such trade negotiation. For example, a developing country like India would like to protect sensitive sectors like agriculture, dairy and animal husbandry, and few other critical sectors and sensitive sectors, which you can't throw open for foreign competition. Whereas developed countries and developed partners, they will expect higher standards of intellectual property rights. They'll expect higher environmental and labor standards to be followed. They will expect higher standards of sanitary and hygiene and phytosanitary measures, which might be very hard for a developing nation like India to implement. Such higher standards could bring an enormous cost on Indian producers. It might drive them out of competition. And if you basically bring down the tariffs and throw open the floodgates, you might be flooded with high quality, cheaper imports, which could destroy your domestic producers. That's why India seeks to protect some sensitive industries like dairy, animal husbandry, etc. And we set up trade barriers through tariffs, whereas India has been willing to open up other sectors. So after multiple rounds of negotiations, in between the talks had stopped as well. It was revived in 2021. Now finally in 2026, the differences have been addressed and both sides have finalized an FTA. Both sides are looking to provide duty-free access to a select list of goods. Most of the tariff lines will now become duty-free, and especially Indian labor-based industries like garments, textiles, pharma, leather, furniture, right? They will tremendously benefit. Even engineering goods and components in the MSME sector, they will all benefit as their exports can boost significantly. This also creates an opportunity for European exports to enter the Indian market, especially high value goods, luxury merchandise to enter the Indian market. That will not affect the lower end of our economy, right? It will mainly appeal to high net worth individuals, creating a niche market for European exporters. So it is believed to be a win-win situation with all concerns being addressed. Though there are some differences present even now, both sides are confident that they'll be able to tackle them and address them eventually. For example, India has one big concern about EU's carbon commitments. See, EU is focused on achieving net neutrality by 2045, 2050. The thing is, they are implementing a tariff on the carbon emissions that might have occurred in another country through a mechanism called as Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the CBAM. So under this, goods imported into EU, they will be imposed with higher tariffs depending on their carbon footprint. Let's say from India, steel is exported to European market. So Europe will now impose extra duties on Indian steel which has been imported depending on its emission contribution in India when it was produced. So Europe is basically clubbing climate policy with free trade agreement. And that is the challenge for India. India believes emission related controls should be dealt separately under the UN Climate Change Convention, under Paris Agreement, and the Conference of Parties under the Climate Change Convention. Because under the UN Climate Change Convention, you have the principle of equity, where common but differentiated responsibilities is implemented, where countries responsible for historical emissions, they are held accountable for a greater share of those responsibilities. But European Union is trying to levy these additional tariffs through trade policy, creating a new type of trade restriction, which could adversely affect Indian exports and essentially penalize Indian industries, which might be polluting industries. Though India has a carbon budget, it might impose an unfair trade restriction, and that remains one issue which is yet to be addressed. But both sides are confident they can overcome these hurdles, and India believes that this deal could be very advantageous for attracting European investments into many important sectors like solar, wind, nuclear energy, right, and even other critical emerging and technological sectors. Then India EU also have very close defense and security partnership. The EU's foreign and security policy aligns with India's goals and priorities. The EU is also prioritizing the Indo-Pacific. The EU also perceives a threat from China's aggression and China's illegitimate claims, territorial claims across the Indo-Pacific. Both sides are equally threatened by global terrorism, especially the terrorism that emanates from the Afghanistan-Pakistan belt. So India has very close security ties, intelligence sharing, counter-terrorism cooperation, and many joint military exercises as well with the European naval force and as well as with individual countries like France, Germany, and the others. So this is what is interesting because Europe is home to a very large Indian diaspora. several million Indians reside and work in the EU, so their visa immigration challenges becomes a focus area for the Indian government. India has been working with EU to streamline the visa immigration process to enable legal migration from India. But European countries have a big complaint that India has become a big source of illegal migration. So, to check illegal migration and to simplify the route for legal migrants, both sides have been entering into mobility migration partnership agreements. In the recent years, India has signed a number of mobility migration partnership agreements, which essentially helps tackle illegal migration from India to Europe and creates a smoother route for legal migrants, students, professional workers who are finding work opportunities in European countries. So, be it in the field of health, climate change, even in the field of clean renewable energy, and as well as in critical emerging technologies from semiconductor fabrication to AI, there are very big developments taking place in the India EU relationship and India's ties in general with European countries. Because don't forget, we have a FTA with United Kingdom as well, right? Recently, India UK have signed a separate free trade agreement because UK has exited the EU. Then Prime Minister Modi has visited multiple European countries in recent years. Apart from covering major countries like UK, France, Germany, and Italy, Prime Minister Modi has been visiting even the smaller countries. For example, there is renewed focus on the Nordic Scandinavia region. Recently, India Nordic countries held their third summit, where PM Modi interacted with leaders of Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Iceland. Then PM Modi visited Netherlands, where a critical deal has been signed between a Dutch company called ASML, which is a global monopoly on lithography machines, which are critical for manufacturing your GPUs, graphic processing units, which are the base infrastructure for your AI processing. And India's Tata Group has entered into a deal with ASML, making it a critical strategic partnership. India is working with these countries to even strengthen supply chains, especially the IMEC project, India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. India is looking to establish alternate routes to connect with, let's say, Italy, Greece, France, and the Mediterranean region and the Balkan region, which can further be integrated with the trans European networks. But the main concern in Europe as of now is the conflict that has broken out in Eastern Europe. The Russian aggression against Ukraine, the ongoing war, and the escalation that has occurred recently. This is Europe's first war in many, many decades, right? After Second World War, Europe had largely stabilized. It had not seen any major conflict. And today, the Russia-Ukraine war that has lasted 4 years has destabilized the entire continent. It exposed Europe's dependency on Russian energy supplies of oil and gas. It has highlighted how countries like Russia could potentially violate international law and the sovereignty of other nations. There's very little that others can do about it. Then you have leaders like Donald Trump, under which the US has become an unreliable partner, with Trump questioning the relevance of NATO, then pushing European countries to invest more in their military modernization. And honestly, in this regard, Trump is right because European countries had become complacent with regard to their own defense. They were not spending adequately. NATO mandates a minimum 2% of their GDP to be spent on military expenditure, and most European countries were falling short of the target. Now the target has been increased to 5% of their GDP. And now the countries have woken up to the threat following Russia's invasion, and they are stepping up military modernization. Then Europe has become the key provider of aid and support and weapons and intelligence to Ukraine. Europe has pumped billions of euros into Ukraine to aid the war efforts. It has levied stringent sanctions against Russia, complicating the ties for India. That's where a friction came up between India and European countries. These European nations, as you know, they can be highly hypocritical. They started accusing India of being a laundromat, that India was buying cheap Russian oil by bypassing the Western sanctions and re exporting the petroleum products back to Europe. The thing is, India basically focuses on its own self interest, national interests. right? Europe has this habit of thinking that its problems should be the world's problems, while Europe doesn't care about the problems of the others. So India has taken a firm stand in this regard that India will pursue an independent foreign policy, right, which is the foundational principle of our foreign policy establishment. So while India has continued to engage with Russia, we have opened up to Ukraine as well. We have been trying to push both sides to negotiate, to sit and talk, and try to bring this war to an end. So, as part of these renewed efforts of India in Europe, we are seeing a new diplomatic push under the Modi government, especially Central Eastern Europe, which had long been neglected. They have come back under focus. See, historically, India prioritized Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and even the Nordic region. Though back in 1960s and 70s, though we did engage with Central Eastern Europe, the focus on this region had been lost after 1991, after the Cold War ended. Historically, we did have close links with all the European nations, but in the last 3 4 decades, our focus on Central Eastern Europe has gone down. Our focus on Western Europe, Nordic region, and the Mediterranean region has increased. So now, India is reorienting its approach towards Europe by paying special attention to Central Eastern Europe. In the last few years, PM Modi has visited multiple countries. PM Modi has traveled to Poland, to Ukraine during the war, offering to mediate between Russia and Ukraine, even offering assistance to Ukraine on humanitarian grounds. Then PM Modi visited Austria, Cyprus, and Croatia as well, which are critical for the proposed IMEC corridor. The India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor will link up with the strategic ports of Greece and Italy, creating an opening into the Balkan region and southern Europe, from where the network can be linked with France, Germany, UK, and the others. So India is closely working with all these countries from Croatia to Cyprus. PM Modi recently visited Slovakia as well during the G7 summit that was recently hosted by France. So all of this shows India's renewed focus on all the sections, all the parts of Europe which are important. This can increase our export market. It can give us better access for stepping up our exports. It can help India counter the Chinese influence which has built up under the Belt and Road Initiative. Especially in Central Eastern Europe, through the Belt and Road Initiative, China has really stepped up its presence and influence. And India can counter that influence to some extent and also focus on creating resilient supply chains that will serve India's interests, mainly to secure access to key minerals, key resources. So you are seeing a renewed approach from India towards Europe with all the new FTAs, the FTA with United Kingdom, FTA with European Union, FTA with EFTA countries, and all the visits of the Prime Minister clearly points towards a heightened focus on Europe, which could become a key driver of India's growth engine. So, on this note, I bring this discussion to an end. We've understood how Europe integrated after the World War period, how it navigated through the Cold War era with formation of institutions and regional blocs, and how it eventually paved the way for the establishment of European Union, which has now championed the rise and stability of the European continent. We even evaluated all the challenges present, along with a brief outlook of India's ties with the Europe region. So, on this note, let's end the discussion. If you like the class, do let me know through your comments. Do press the like button and don't forget to share the video with other aspirants. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again on Monday at 7 p.m. in the evening. Today, we took an early session mainly because of the mains exam. Because evening we have the essay paper discussion. So don't forget to join us live at 5 p.m. So NCRT course will continue from next Monday onwards at 7 p.m. That's it. Thanks for watching.